The Royal Opera House glittered like a jewel box on the evening of April 15th, 1815, its chandeliers casting golden light across the assembled fashionable world of London society. And Miss Eleanor Pembroke sat rigid in her seat, trying desperately to draw breath. The pale blue gown she wore, borrowed from her cousin Lady Catherine Ashford's cast-offs, had never fit properly. But tonight it seemed determined to suffocate her, the boning of her corset pressing into her ribs with a cruelty that made each shallow breath a conscious effort. Catherine had insisted her lady's maid lace Eleanor tighter this morning, her cold eyes travelling over Eleanor's plain figure with obvious distaste as she murmured something about not disgracing the family at opening night. Eleanor was 28 years old, a spinster and a poor relation who had lived on the Ashfords' charity for 5 long years since her parents' deaths had left her penniless, and she had learned that gratitude meant silence, even when one could not breathe. The opera house hummed with conversation, ladies in their silks and jewels fanning themselves languidly while gentlemen postured in their evening dress, and Eleanor felt invisible among them, a shadow in faded blue, while Catherine blazed beside her in crimson silk, holding court with Lord Charles Ashford and their circle of admirers. The orchestra began tuning their instruments, the discordant notes slowly resolving into harmony, and Eleanor felt her vision begin to blur at the edges, black spots dancing before her eyes. She pressed one gloved hand to her stays, willing herself to endure, because causing a scene would mean Catherine's displeasure, and that was a price she had learned was far too costly to pay. Across the theatre in the Duke's box, Alexander Sinclair lounged with an expression of profound boredom, his dark eyes scanning the crowd below with the weary resignation of a man who had attended too many such evenings and found them all equally tedious. At 34, the Duke of Sinclair possessed both wealth and title enough to excuse him from these performances, yet duty and social expectation bound even dukes. And so he had come, his mind already wandering to the book waiting in his study. But then his gaze snagged on something unusual. A young woman in pale blue sitting unnaturally still in the Ashford box, her face chalk white, her chest barely moving. He straightened slightly, his attention caught by the wrongness of her posture, the way her hand clutched at her bodice. The curtain rose, and Mozart's glorious music filled the space, the soprano's voice soaring through the first aria, and Eleanor felt the room tilt sideways as her corset seemed to tighten further, crushing the air from her lungs. She tried to focus on the stage, on anything but the crushing pressure and the roaring in her ears. But darkness was creeping in from all sides now, and her last conscious thought before she began to fall was that she hoped, desperately, that her collapse would not embarrass Catherine too terribly much. Eleanor felt herself falling forward, her body no longer her own to command, and in the last fragment of awareness before darkness claimed her completely, she heard the soprano's voice soaring impossibly high while the world tilted and spun. She collapsed across the velvet-cushioned railing of the box, her pale blue skirts tangling around her legs, and the sound that escaped her lips was barely human, a desperate wheeze that carried no air because there was no air left in her crushed lungs. Catherine gasped beside her, not in concern but in horror, her gloved hand flying to her mouth as she recoiled from Eleanor's prone form as though unconsciousness were somehow contagious or offensive. The music faltered, violins trailing into uncertain silence as the soprano stopped mid-phrase, and a ripple of shocked whispers spread through the theatre like wildfire through dry grass. Ladies raised their opera glasses not to view the stage, but to examine the spectacle of Miss Pembroke's collapse, their faces alight with scandalized fascination, while gentlemen murmured behind their hands and made no move whatsoever to offer assistance. Lord Charles Ashford stood frozen, his expression caught between embarrassment and indecision, clearly calculating whether acknowledging his wife's poor relation publicly would be more damaging than ignoring her entirely, and the answer he arrived at was evident in his continued stillness. In the box across the theatre, Alexander was already moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct, his body responding to the wrongness of the scene with a decisiveness that had been honed through years of bearing responsibility for others. He saw what no one else seemed to register, that the young woman was not merely swooning in some affected display, but genuinely dying, her lips taking on a bluish tinge even from this distance, her chest utterly motionless beneath the tightly fitted bodice. He vaulted over the railing of his box with an athleticism that would have seemed undignified in a duke had anyone been positioned to comment, landing in the aisle below with sure footing before striding rapidly toward the Ashford box. The crowd parted before him automatically, rank and bearing creating a path where common humanity had failed, and he was dimly aware of the mounting whispers that followed his progress, speculation and shock bleeding into the charged air. He reached the Ashford box in seconds that felt like hours, shouldering past Charles without ceremony and dropping to his knees beside Eleanor's collapsed form. Her face was waxen, lips parted in a silent gasp, and when he pressed his fingers to her throat, the pulse he found was thready and rapid, her body fighting desperately for oxygen it could not draw. Alexander had seen corset injuries before, had listened to physicians discuss the barbaric practice of tight lacing and its medical consequences, and he understood with perfect clarity that propriety would kill this woman if someone did not act immediately. He looked up at Catherine, whose crimson silks seemed to blaze with accusatory fire in the golden light, and his voice when he spoke was cold with controlled fury. "She needs air now," he said flatly, and then, without waiting for permission or protest, he reached for the fastenings of Eleanor's gown. Catherine's shriek of protest cut through the silence like a knife. "Niftuam!" "Your Grace, you cannot, propriety." But Alexander ignored her utterly, his fingers working with swift precision at the tiny buttons running down Eleanor's spine, while the entire theatre watched in frozen horror. His movements were clinical, efficient, the motion of a man who understood that seconds mattered more than reputation, and he peeled back the fabric of her bodice to reveal the corset beneath, laced so tightly that the strings had created deep grooves in the material. The collective gasp that rose from the assembled audience was almost musical in its synchronized shock, ladies clutching their fans as though they themselves were being undressed, gentlemen averting their eyes with scandalized fascination while simultaneously watching through the gaps in their fingers. Alexander's jaw tightened as he saw the true extent of the barbaric lacing, the strings pulled so cruelly tight that they had compressed Eleanor's ribcage to an unnatural degree, and without hesitation he drew a small knife from his boot and sliced through the laces in 3 quick cuts. The corset sprang open like a trap releasing its victim, and for one terrible moment Eleanor remained utterly still, her body so starved for air that it seemed to have forgotten how to draw breath. Then her chest expanded in a sudden desperate gasp, a sound that was half sob and half relief, and color began to return to her blue-tinged lips as oxygen finally reached her starved lungs. Alexander gathered her against his chest, supporting her weight as her breathing normalized from desperate gasps to shuddering draws, and he was aware, with some distant part of his mind, that he was holding a young woman in a state of shocking undress before the entirety of London society, but he found he could not bring himself to care, even slightly. Catherine was still protesting, her voice shrill with outrage about scandal and disgrace and what people would say, and Alexander turned his head to look at her with such cold fury that she actually stepped backward, her crimson silks rustling. "This woman nearly died because vanity demanded she be laced into a prison," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent theatre. And if propriety values appearance over life, then propriety be cursed." The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of shocked whispers spreading outward through the boxes and galleries. And Alexander was dimly aware that he had just created a scandal that would be discussed for months, possibly years. Eleanor stirred in his arms, a calm, small confused sound escaping her lips, and he looked down at her with an expression that softened immediately from fury to concern. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bewildered, and he watched awareness slowly return to her face, followed immediately by mortification as she realized her state of undress and the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and meant only for her. "You are safe now. Just breathe." Around them the theatre remained frozen in tableau, the stage abandoned, the musicians clutching their instruments uncertainly. And in that moment, Alexander Sinclair made a decision that would alter the course of 2 lives, his hand tightening protectively around Eleanor's shoulders as he prepared to carry her from this place of judgment into something that might, with time and care, become salvation. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Eleanor's eyes focused slowly, the golden glow of the chandelier above fragmenting into shards of light that gradually resolved into the faces staring down at her. And the first clear thought that pierced through her confusion was not concern for her health, but absolute mortification that hundreds of people were witnessing her disgrace. She was lying in someone's arms, she realized with dawning horror, held against a broad chest in a position of shocking intimacy. And when she tried to move, her body protested with sharp aches that radiated from her ribs. The face above her came into focus, strong features marked by concern, grey eyes that held something she could not quite name. And she understood with a jolt that this was the Duke of Sinclair, a man so far above her station that she had never imagined speaking to him, much less being cradled against him, while her clothing hung open in disarray. She tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but her throat was raw, and the only sound that emerged was a mortifying whimper. His expression softened immediately, those grey eyes warming with something that looked almost like tenderness, and his voice when he spoke was low and meant only for her ears despite the hundreds straining to hear. "You are safe now, Miss Pembroke. Just breathe. Everything else can wait." The sound of her name on his lips startled her, the realization that he knew who she was somehow more shocking than everything else that had transpired. And she became suddenly aware of how she must look, her borrowed gown gaping open, her hair falling from its pins, her face no doubt blotched and swollen from oxygen deprivation. She tried again to move, to pull away, to salvage some tiny fragment of dignity, but his arm tightened around her shoulders with gentle firmness. "Do not try to rise yet," he said quietly. "Your body needs time to recover." Around them, the theatre remained suspended in stunned silence, shock having given way to avid fascination as society witnessed the impossible tableau of a duke cradling a nobody with protective tenderness. Eleanor caught sight of Catherine standing rigid with fury and humiliation, her crimson silks seeming to vibrate with indignation, and the look her cousin turned upon her was so venomous that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Alexander followed her gaze and his jaw tightened, his free hand moving to shrug out of his evening coat, which he then draped carefully around Eleanor's shoulders, covering her exposed corset and disheveled bodice with fabric that smelled of bergamot and something clean and masculine. The gesture was so unexpected, so thoughtlessly kind, that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, emotion flooding through the fissure with painful intensity. "I am sorry," she managed to whisper, though whether she was apologizing to him or to Catherine or to the assembled masses she could not have said. Alexander looked down at her with an expression that held something fierce and protective. "You have nothing whatsoever to apologize for," he said firmly, and then, without asking permission or waiting for protest, he rose to his feet in one fluid motion, lifting her with him as though she weighed nothing at all. Eleanor gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at his shoulders for balance, and she heard the renewed buzz of shocked whispers cascade through the theatre as he turned toward the exit with her held securely in his arms. A voice called out from somewhere in the crowd, something about propriety and scandal, and Alexander ignored it utterly, his stride never faltering as he carried her down the steps from the Ashford box. She should protest, Eleanor thought distantly, should insist on walking, should do something to minimize the spectacle. But her body felt boneless and strange, ribs aching with every breath, and the solid strength of his arms felt like the first safety she had known in years. They reached the main corridor, and Alexander paused, his eyes scanning the milling crowd until they fixed on someone, and Eleanor turned her head to see Mrs. Martha Beaumont hurrying toward them, her kind face creased with concern. Mrs. Beaumont reached them slightly breathless, her hand going immediately to Eleanor's forehead. "The poor child," she said softly. "What have they done to you?" Alexander's voice when he addressed her was respectful but brooking no argument. "I am taking Miss Pembroke to my residence where my physician can attend her. Will you accompany us as chaperone?" Mrs. Beaumont did not hesitate even slightly. "Of course, Your Grace, absolutely." Behind them, Catherine's voice rang out sharp with panic and fury, calling Eleanor's name, demanding she return at once. But Alexander simply shifted his grip and continued toward the exit, carrying Eleanor away from judgment into something that felt impossibly like rescue. The Clare House on. Berkeley Square stood elegant and imposing in the lamplight as Alexander's carriage drew to a halt before its entrance, and Eleanor found herself carried up the marble steps, still wrapped in the Duke's evening coat, while Mrs. Beaumont followed close behind, with worried hands fluttering near Eleanor's pale face. The entry hall blazed with light from a crystal chandelier that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with portraits of Sinclair ancestors, who seemed to gaze down with austere judgment upon the disheveled young woman being transported through their domain, and Eleanor felt mortification wash over her again as liveried servants appeared from doorways with expressions of carefully controlled shock. Alexander issued quiet instructions to a tall man who materialized at his elbow, his voice calm and authoritative as he requested that Dr. Harrison be summoned immediately and that tea be prepared. And then he was carrying Eleanor through a doorway into a room that smelled of leather and old paper and wood smoke. The study wrapped around her like an embrace, all dark paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with volumes whose gilt titles caught the firelight, and Alexander lowered her with surprising gentleness onto a deep leather sofa positioned near the hearth where flames crackled with welcoming warmth. Mrs. Beaumont was there instantly, tucking cushions behind Eleanor's back and fussing with the coat still draped around her shoulders, and Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror above the mantelpiece, hair hanging in tangled strands, face blotched and swollen, the borrowed pale blue gown gaping open beneath Alexander's black coat. She looked away quickly, humiliation burning in her throat, and became aware that Alexander had knelt beside the sofa, those grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. "How are you feeling, Miss Pembroke?" he asked quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he actually cared about the answer, rather than asking from mere politeness. Eleanor opened her mouth to say she was fine, to apologize again, to beg his pardon for the terrible inconvenience, but what emerged instead was a shaking whisper. "My ribs hurt terribly." Alexander's expression darkened, and he glanced toward Mrs. Beaumont, who had settled into a nearby chair. "The lacing," he said grimly. "It was tight enough to crack bone. I have never seen anything so barbaric." Mrs. Beaumont made a small, distressed sound and reached forward to pat Eleanor's hand. "The poor dear has been living with Lady Catherine Ashford these past 5 years as a poor relation," she said softly, and there was something in her tone that conveyed worlds of meaning in those few words. Eleanor saw understanding flash across Alexander's face, followed by something that looked remarkably like anger, and she wanted to protest that it was not so terrible, that Catherine had provided her a home when she had nowhere else to go, but the words died unspoken because they would have been lies. A servant appeared bearing a tea tray which Mrs. Beaumont took charge of with capable efficiency, and Eleanor accepted the delicate cup with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers while the fragrant liquid soothed her raw throat. Alexander had risen and now stood with one arm resting on the mantelpiece, firelight playing across features that seemed carved from granite, and when he spoke his voice was measured, but she could hear fury simmering beneath the surface. "Tell me, Miss Pembroke," he said quietly, "was tonight's lacing unusual, or is this how you are always dressed?" Eleanor stared into her teacup, shame washing over her in waves. "Catherine's maid always laces me tightly," she whispered, "but tonight was worse than usual because the gown was too small and Catherine said it had to fit properly." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and Mrs. Beaumont's soft sound of distress, and when Eleanor finally found courage to look up, she saw Alexander watching her with an expression that held something fierce and protective and utterly unexpected, as though he had just made some private decision whose consequences would ripple far beyond this quiet room. Eleanor woke in the narrow attic room that had been her home for 5 years, to grey morning light filtering through a single small window, and for one blessed moment she could not remember why her ribs ached so terribly, or why dread pooled heavy in her stomach. But then memory crashed over her in waves, and she closed her eyes against the mortification of recalling how she had fainted at the opera, how the Duke of Sinclair had loosened her corset in front of everyone, how she had been carried through the theatre like a child while hundreds watched with avid fascination. She sat up carefully, each breath sending sharp pains through her torso, and caught sight of herself in the tiny spotted mirror above the washstand, her face still bearing the blotched evidence of last night's distress, her hair a tangled mess around her shoulders. The borrowed pale blue gown lay draped over the single chair where she had left it, a symbol of everything that had gone so catastrophically wrong, and she wanted nothing more than to burn it and forget the entire wretched evening had ever happened. A sharp knock on the door made her flinch, and Catherine's voice called through the wood with icy precision that Eleanor should present herself in the drawing-room immediately, and the tone promised nothing good. Eleanor dressed with trembling fingers in her own grey morning dress, one of only 3 she owned, and made her way down the narrow servants' staircase that she was expected to use rather than the main stairs reserved for family, her ribs protesting with each step. Catherine was standing by the window when Eleanor entered the drawing-room, sunlight streaming through the glass to illuminate the newspaper clutched in her hands, and when she turned, her expression was a mask of fury barely contained beneath a veneer of propriety. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Catherine asked in a voice like winter frost. "Any comprehension of the scandal you have brought upon this household?" Eleanor opened her mouth to apologize, but Catherine continued without pause, advancing across the room to thrust the newspaper toward her with a shaking hand. The Morning Chronicle had devoted half a column to the previous evening's spectacle, the writer's prose dripping with innuendo as it described how Miss Eleanor P., poor relation to Lady C., had caused such a scene at the opera that the Duke of S. had been moved to personally attend her, loosening her clothing in full view of society, in what could only be described as the most shocking breach of propriety witnessed this season. The words seemed to blur on the page as Eleanor read, each sentence more damning than the last, and she could feel Catherine's rage radiating across the space between them like physical heat. "You have made us the laughingstock of London," Catherine hissed. "You with your weakness and your fainting spells, and your inability to conduct yourself with even basic dignity. I should never have taken you in when your parents died, never allowed you under my roof." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, the familiar pain of knowing she was unwanted, of being reminded again that she existed on sufferance and charity, and she looked down at the newspaper to hide the tears that burned behind her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to cause trouble. The corset was so tight and I could not breathe." Catherine's laugh was sharp and cruel. "The corset was no tighter than any decent woman wears," she snapped. "But you have always been delicate and useless, unable to bear what others manage perfectly well, and now you have cost us our reputation and my standing in society." A voice from the doorway interrupted, Charles Ashford clearing his throat with obvious discomfort, and Eleanor looked up to see him holding another newspaper with an expression torn between concern and irritation. "Catherine," he said carefully, "the Duke of Sinclair is here to call on Miss Pembroke. He is waiting in the front parlour with flowers." The silence that followed was absolute, Catherine's face going through a remarkable transformation from rage to shock to calculation in the space of seconds, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to pound with something between hope and terror as she realized that Alexander had come, that he had not dismissed last night as merely an unfortunate incident requiring a duke's brief intervention, that for reasons she could not begin to fathom, he had sought her out in the cold light of morning with white roses clutched in his hand. The afternoon of April 18th arrived with spring sunshine streaming through the windows of the Ashford drawing-room, where Eleanor sat perched on the edge of a chair, wearing her simple grey day dress, the same worn garment she always wore when going out because she owned nothing finer, and her fingers twisted nervously in her lap as Catherine paced before the fireplace with barely concealed fury at the fact that the Duke of Sinclair had not only called twice in the past 2 days, but had now sent word requesting permission to take Miss Pembroke driving in Hyde Park. Charles had granted permission immediately, far too conscious of the Duke's rank to refuse, and Catherine had been forced to watch helplessly as Eleanor prepared to spend the afternoon in the company of London's most eligible bachelor, though she had insisted with vicious precision that Mrs. Beaumont must accompany them as chaperone, and that Eleanor was not to embarrass the family any further with weakness or improper behavior. When Alexander's carriage arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon, Eleanor descended the front steps with trembling knees, intensely aware of the fine weather and the fashionable crowds who would be parading through the park, and she found Alexander waiting beside an open barouche drawn by matched grey horses, his tall figure elegant in a dark blue coat, and his expression warming as he caught sight of her. Mrs. Beaumont settled herself on the rear-facing seat, with a kind smile that suggested she intended to be the most discreet chaperone in London, and Alexander handed Eleanor up into the carriage with a touch that sent warmth flooding through her, despite the careful correctness of his manner. The park was magnificent, with spring blossoms weighing down the branches of trees that lined the paths and creating canopies of white and pink against the brilliant sky, and Eleanor found herself acutely conscious of the other carriages passing theirs, of the mounted riders who slowed their horses to stare, of the whispers and pointed fingers that followed their progress along Rotten Row. "I hope you have recovered from your ordeal, Miss Pembroke," Alexander said quietly, once they had cleared the park gates, and there was genuine concern in his voice that made Eleanor's careful composure waver. "I am much better. Thank you, Your Grace," she replied carefully, "and I must apologize again for the terrible scene I caused. You have been so kind, and I fear I have repaid your assistance by damaging your reputation as well as my own." Alexander's expression shifted to something almost like amusement mixed with exasperation, and he turned in the seat to face her more directly. "Miss Pembroke," he said with unexpected firmness, "you have nothing for which to apologize. You nearly died because society has decided that women should be constrained to the point of suffocation in the name of fashion, and I will not hear you take blame for the cruelty of others." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, and Eleanor stared at him in confusion, because gentlemen simply did not speak this way, did not challenge the established order or suggest that fashion itself might be at fault, rather than female weakness. "I notice you are reading," Alexander continued with a gesture toward the small volume Eleanor had brought. "May I ask what has captured your attention?" Eleanor glanced down at the book in her lap, a borrowed copy of Wordsworth's poems that Mrs. Beaumont had lent her, and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Just poetry, Your Grace," she murmured, "nothing of consequence." Alexander's eyebrow rose in a manner that suggested he found her dismissal unconvincing. "Wordsworth is hardly inconsequential," he said mildly. "I am particularly fond of his observations on nature and memory. Do you have a favorite among his works?" And just like that they were talking, truly talking, as the carriage rolled through the park and the spring afternoon unfolded around them like a blessing, and Eleanor felt something locked tight inside her chest begin very slowly to unfold. The evening of April 22nd arrived with Eleanor standing before the mirror in Mrs. Beaumont's guest room, wearing a gown that actually fit her properly for the first time in years, a dress of soft rose silk that Martha had insisted on lending her, and as she studied her reflection, Eleanor barely recognized the woman looking back, because the color brought warmth to her complexion, and the proper fit showed that her figure, though slight, was not entirely without grace. Alexander had sent a note that morning inviting her to a small dinner party at Sinclair House. Just 8 guests, he had written. "People I think you will find interesting." And Eleanor had felt equal parts anticipation and terror at the prospect of meeting his friends, of being seen in company with him in a more intimate setting than a carriage ride through the park. Mrs. Beaumont accompanied her in the carriage to provide propriety, chattering cheerfully about how Alexander's sister Diana was traveling abroad, but would surely return for any wedding, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the assumption, even as hope fluttered dangerously in her chest. Sinclair House blazed with welcoming light when they arrived, and Alexander met them in the entrance hall wearing evening dress that made him look both elegant and somehow more approachable, his smile warming as he took Eleanor's hand and led her toward the drawing room, where other guests were already assembled. The company proved to be nothing like the rigid society gatherings Eleanor had endured with the Ashfords. Instead, Alexander introduced her to a mix of intellectuals and reformers, including a lady writer who published essays on women's education, a member of Parliament known for his progressive views, a physician who lectured at the Royal College, and their spouses who were equally unconventional and welcoming. Eleanor found herself seated between Alexander and the lady writer at dinner, the conversation flowing around the table, touching on topics that made her pulse quicken with excitement, debates about expanding access to education, discussions of social reform and the responsibilities of those with privilege, passionate exchanges about literature and philosophy that reminded Eleanor of conversations she had once shared with her father before his death. She spoke hesitantly at first, offering a quiet observation about a book that had been mentioned, and Alexander turned to her with such genuine interest and encouragement that she found herself continuing, her thoughts gaining confidence as others around the table listened and responded with respect rather than condescension. The physician mentioned his work with women who suffered injuries from restrictive clothing and corsetry, his voice taking on anger as he described the damage he had witnessed, and Eleanor felt Alexander's gaze on her as the doctor spoke, his expression suggesting that her own ordeal at the opera had been very much on his mind when he assembled this particular gathering. When dinner concluded and the party moved to the music room where someone played piano and others continued their conversations in smaller groups, Alexander guided Eleanor to a window seat overlooking the garden, with a light touch on her elbow that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps his interest was not merely kindness or pity, but something deeper and more miraculous than she had dared imagine. The morning of April 25th arrived with rain streaking the windows of Eleanor's small attic room in the Ashford house, and she sat on the narrow bed with trembling hands as Catherine's voice echoed up the stairwell, sharp with barely contained fury, summoning her to the drawing room for what Eleanor knew would be an unpleasant confrontation. She had felt the shift in the household atmosphere over the past 3 days since the dinner party at Sinclair House, Catherine's coldness hardening into something more dangerous, and as Eleanor descended the servants' stairs, she caught whispers from the maids that made her stomach clench with dread. Catherine stood by the fireplace when Eleanor entered, her expression glacial, and her fingers drumming against the mantelpiece in a gesture Eleanor had learned to recognize as a precursor to cruelty. "I have been in correspondence with your late mother's cousin in Yorkshire," Catherine began without preamble. "Mrs. Thornfield has agreed to take you into her household as companion to her elderly mother. You will depart on Friday, which gives you 3 days to prepare yourself." The words hit Eleanor like cold water, and she felt the room tilt slightly because Yorkshire was 200 miles away, and Mrs. Thornfield was a woman she had met only once at a funeral 10 years ago, a stern widow who lived in near isolation on the moors. "But Catherine," Eleanor began carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "the Duke has expressed an interest in continuing our acquaintance. Surely it would be improper to leave London while—" Catherine's laugh cut through the air like breaking glass. "The Duke's interest is merely charitable pity," she said with vicious precision, "and I will not have you embarrassing this family further by presuming to aspire above your station. You are 28 years old, with no fortune, no prospects, and you should be grateful that anyone is willing to provide you shelter after the scandal you created at the opera." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, her hands clenched in the fabric of her plain grey dress as Catherine continued outlining the arrangements with cold efficiency, and she was about to turn and flee back to her room when Mrs. Beaumont was announced by the butler, her friend sweeping into the drawing-room with unusual urgency and requesting a private word with Eleanor that Catherine could not refuse without obvious rudeness. In the hallway, Martha gripped Eleanor's hands with fierce intensity and spoke in a rapid whisper. "She is jealous," Martha said bluntly. "Everyone can see that the Duke's interest in you is genuine, and Catherine cannot bear it. You must send word to him immediately because I believe if he knew of this threat, he would act." Eleanor shook her head in confused denial, because surely Alexander's kindness was exactly what Catherine claimed, merely pity extended to someone who had suffered misfortune. But Martha was already pressing a note into her hand that she had taken the liberty of writing to Sinclair House, and Eleanor found herself agreeing in a daze to have it sent. Less than 2 hours later, Alexander's carriage appeared before the Ashford residence, and the Duke himself strode into the entrance hall with a purposeful energy that made the butler stumble over his words, and when Alexander's eyes met Eleanor's across the hallway, she saw something blazing in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Pembroke," Alexander said with careful formality that barely concealed the intensity beneath, "I wonder if you might grant me a private word in the garden, with Mrs. Beaumont's accompaniment, of course, for propriety." The Ashford garden lay damp from recent rain as Alexander led Eleanor down the gravel path toward a secluded corner near the old stone wall where climbing roses were just beginning to bud, and Mrs. Beaumont tactfully positioned herself by the gate where she could provide propriety while allowing them privacy for conversation. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked beside him, acutely aware of the intensity radiating from his tall frame, And when they reached the bench beneath the ancient oak tree, Alexander turned to face her with an expression so earnest and vulnerable that it made her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Pembroke," he began, then stopped and shook his head slightly as though dissatisfied with the formality. "Eleanor," he said more softly, "I understand from Mrs. Beaumont that your cousin intends to send you away to Yorkshire." She nodded mutely because her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely, and Alexander continued, with carefully controlled emotion. "I cannot allow that to happen," he said. "Not when I have found in you something I had ceased to believe existed in all of society, someone whose mind challenges me, whose kindness moves me, whose very presence has awakened feelings I thought myself incapable of experiencing." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes as she struggled to make sense of his words, her hands trembling where she had clasped them together. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you do not need to speak so out of pity or obligation. I understand that your kindness toward me has been born of compassion for someone who suffered misfortune, but I could not bear for you to bind yourself out of mere charity." Alexander's jaw tightened, and he reached for her hands with sudden urgency, his touch warm and steady as he held her trembling fingers. "Pity," he said with something almost like anger threading through his voice. "Eleanor, I kneel before you now, not from pity but from love." And to her absolute astonishment, he did precisely that, lowering himself to one knee on the damp gravel path while maintaining his grip on her hands, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight into her frightened heart. "For 10 days I have known you," he continued, "and in that brief time you have shown me more genuine worth, more intelligence, more grace under cruelty than I have witnessed in 34 years among the supposed elite of society. You have made me laugh and think and hope for a future I had resigned myself to living without." From his coat pocket he withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring of exquisite simplicity, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the grey afternoon light. "This was my grandmother's ring," Alexander said, "given to a woman of true character who defied convention to marry the man she loved, and I can think of no one more worthy to wear it than you." Eleanor shook her head in instinctive denial, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am 28 years old with no fortune and no family and no beauty," she said brokenly. "Society will say you have lost your senses, that I have trapped you somehow. I cannot let you sacrifice yourself." Alexander rose swiftly and cupped her face in his hands with a tenderness that made her heart shatter and reform in the same instant. "You are beautiful," he said fiercely, not in the vapid way society measures such things, but in ways that matter, in your kindness to servants, in your hunger for knowledge, in your dignity when faced with cruelty, in the way your whole face illuminates when you speak of something that moves you. And as for sacrifice, the only sacrifice would be living without you now that I have found you. Will you marry me, Eleanor? Will you become my Duchess and my partner and the person I come home to every evening for the rest of my life?" She could not speak past the tightness in her throat, so she simply nodded. And Alexander's face transformed with a joy so pure it took her breath away as he slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger and then, with infinite gentleness, leaned forward to press his lips to hers in a kiss that was brief and tender and tasted of promise and rain and the beginning of everything. They walked back toward the house together with Eleanor's hand tucked into the crook of Alexander's arm, and the sapphire ring catching the fading afternoon light like a small star on her finger. And though her heart still raced with the unreality of what had just occurred, she felt a fierce determination rising within her as they approached the entrance where they both knew Catherine awaited. Alexander paused at the door and looked down at her with an expression that mingled tenderness with something harder and more protective. "I will not allow her to speak to you with cruelty," he said quietly. "You are my betrothed now, and any insult to you is an insult to me, and to my house, do you understand?" Eleanor nodded mutely because speaking seemed impossible, past the emotion swelling in her throat. And then Alexander was opening the door and leading her through the entrance hall toward the drawing room where voices could be heard, Catherine's sharp tones rising above her husband's lower rumble. The moment they entered the room, Catherine's words died mid-sentence as her gaze dropped immediately to Eleanor's hand, where the unmistakable gleam of the Sinclair sapphire blazed against her pale skin. And for a long, frozen moment, no one spoke as the full implication settled over the room like falling snow. "Lord Ashford," Alexander said with perfect formality, though his voice carried an edge of steel that Eleanor had never heard before, "I am come to inform you that Miss Pembroke has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my hand in marriage, and I trust we have your blessing and congratulations." Charles Ashford rose hastily from his chair, his expression cycling through shock and confusion before settling into something that resembled grudging pleasure, because refusing to congratulate a duke was unthinkable, regardless of personal feelings, and he crossed the room with hand extended to offer stiff felicitations, while Catherine remained frozen by the window. "How?" Catherine finally managed, and the single word dripped with venom and disbelief as her eyes fixed on Eleanor with something approaching hatred. "How did you manage this? What lies did you tell him about your circumstances? What manipulations?" Alexander's entire posture changed in an instant, his frame seeming to grow taller and colder as he turned the full weight of his rank and authority toward Catherine in a way that made even Charles step back slightly. "Lady Ashford," Alexander said with icy precision, "I will allow you this single opportunity to reconsider both your words and your tone. My betrothed is a woman of exceptional character who has endured mistreatment in this house with a grace and dignity that speaks to her. True, Worth, and I suggest you govern yourself accordingly." Catherine's face flushed an ugly red, but she pressed her lips together in furious silence, and Alexander continued with calm authority that brooked no argument. "Miss Pembroke will be removing her possessions from your residence this evening and will reside with Mrs. Beaumont until our wedding, which will take place on May 17th. You will, of course, receive an invitation, though I trust you will understand if we keep the gathering intimate." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, but whether from relief or lingering shock she could not say. And when Alexander glanced down at her with such obvious concern and affection that it made Catherine's jaw tighten, she found herself standing straighter and meeting her cousin's gaze with newfound courage. Within the hour, Alexander's footman had collected Eleanor's few belongings from the attic room that had been her prison for 5 years, and as she walked out of the Ashford house for the last time, with Alexander's hand steady at her back and the sapphire ring warm on her finger, she did not look back, even once. Eleanor woke the next morning in Mrs. Beaumont's guest room, feeling as though the previous evening had been some fever dream conjured by desperate longing, until she lifted her left hand and saw the sapphire ring gleaming against her finger in the pale April sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. And then the reality of it all crashed over her with such force that she pressed her face into the pillow and wept with a mixture of joy and lingering disbelief. By the time she had dressed in one of her few serviceable gowns, a simple grey muslin that suddenly seemed impossibly shabby, the breakfast room was already abuzz with Mrs. Beaumont reading aloud from the morning papers, where news of the engagement had somehow already appeared in the society columns, and the reactions ranged from shocked congratulations to thinly veiled insinuations about fortune hunting that made Eleanor's cheeks burn with shame, even as her friend insisted such venom stemmed purely from jealousy. Alexander arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, as he had promised the night before, looking impossibly handsome in a dark blue coat that matched his eyes, and the warmth in his expression when he saw Eleanor waiting in the drawing-room made her heart perform acrobatics in her chest in a way that would have alarmed her if it had not felt so wonderfully right. "I thought we might visit Madame Dubois this morning," he said with a smile that held both affection and determination. "You will need a proper wardrobe befitting your new station." And before Eleanor could formulate the protest rising to her lips about expense and frivolity, he continued more softly. "I know your instinct is to refuse anything that seems extravagant, but I would ask you to trust me when I say that seeing you dressed as you deserve to be dressed, in fabrics and colors that bring you joy, would give me more pleasure than you can possibly imagine." Mrs. Beaumont accompanied them as chaperone for propriety's sake, though the engagement made such precautions somewhat less critical. And as Alexander handed Eleanor up into his elegant carriage, with the ducal crest emblazoned on the door panel, she caught sight of Lydia Fairfax across the street, staring with such obvious envy that Eleanor felt a small, fierce satisfaction bloom in her chest despite her better nature. Madame Dubois' establishment on Bond Street was the most fashionable modiste in London, a place Eleanor had never dreamed of entering. And when the proprietress herself came forward to greet them with deep curtsies for the Duke and carefully concealed curiosity for his betrothed, Alexander took immediate command of the situation with a grace that suggested he had done this before, though Eleanor tried not to wonder for whom. "My fiancé will require a complete wardrobe," he said with quiet authority. "Day dresses, evening gowns, walking costumes, riding habits, if you are amenable to learning to ride, Eleanor?" And he glanced down at her with such hopeful warmth that she found herself nodding mutely. "And of course her wedding gown, though I trust you to work with her on those particulars, as I understand the groom is not meant to see it beforehand." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor stood surrounded by bolts of silk and muslin and velvet in every color imaginable, while Madame Dubois and her assistants measured and draped and suggested. And though Eleanor tried repeatedly to guide them toward simpler and less expensive options, Alexander quietly but firmly insisted she choose what she truly loved. And when she finally admitted that the deep rose silk reminded her of the garden at her childhood home before her parents died, the expression on his face held such tender understanding that she had to look away before she wept in front of the seamstresses. They ordered 12 gowns in total, with the wedding dress to be created in ivory silk of such delicate beauty it looked like captured moonlight. And when Madame Dubois named the delivery schedule with the wedding gown promised for May 15th, just 2 days before the ceremony, Eleanor felt the reality of it all settling over her like a benediction. She was truly going to marry this extraordinary man who looked at her as though she were precious beyond measure. And as they left the shop with Alexander's hand warm and steady at her back, she finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she deserved this happiness after all. The days following the whirlwind at Madame Dubois passed in a haze of wedding preparations and social calls, but on the afternoon of May the 1st, Eleanor found herself alone with Alexander in his library at Sinclair House, and the intimacy of the moment settled over her like silk as she stood before the floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with volumes in leather bindings of burgundy and forest green and deep midnight blue. Mrs. Beaumont had been called away to attend to a household matter, and though propriety suggested Eleanor should leave, or at least keep the door open, Alexander had quietly closed it behind them, with a look that suggested he craved privacy, not for impropriety, but for the kind of conversation that required walls between oneself and the world. And Eleanor found her heart racing not with fear, but with anticipation of deeper knowing. "I have not been entirely forthcoming about my past," Alexander said quietly, as he guided her to the leather sofa near the fireplace, where afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows in dusty golden bars, and Eleanor felt his hand warm and slightly rough against hers as they sat closer than strict propriety allowed. their knees nearly touching through the layers of fabric. "There was an engagement some years ago," he continued, and his voice held a careful neutrality that suggested old pain carefully examined and set aside. "A young woman of impeccable breeding and fortune, whom my family considered eminently suitable, and whom I believed I could grow to love, given time and proximity." Eleanor's breath caught, but she remained silent, sensing that he needed to speak this history aloud, and Alexander's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand in an absent gesture that suggested he drew comfort from the contact. She ended the engagement. 6 months before our wedding," he said with a faint smile that held no bitterness. She had fallen quite desperately in love with her music master, and though the scandal was considerable, I found myself feeling more relief than grief, which told me everything I needed to know about the authenticity of my own feelings. Eleanor looked up at him then, and found his blue eyes watching her with such focused attention that it made her breath stutter, and she understood suddenly that he was offering her this history, not as confession, but as context, as evidence that what lay between them was different and deeper and more real than anything that had come before. "My parents died when I was 20, Eleanor heard herself saying, though she had not planned to speak. Her father had been a country vicar with more books than income, and my mother had been a gentleman's daughter who married for love rather than position, and they gave me an education far beyond my station, because they believed knowledge was wealth that could never be taken away." Alexander's hand tightened on hers, and his other hand came up to cup her cheek with such tenderness that tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, and she continued speaking past the tightness in her throat about how the fever had taken them both within a week, and how Catherine had been her only living relation, and had taken her in, not from kindness but from duty, and how the 8 years since had been a slow erosion of self until that night at the opera when everything had changed. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," Alexander said with quiet ferocity, "to have endured such diminishment and still retained your essential self, your intelligence and compassion and dignity. Eleanor, you humble me." She shook her head mutely because his words seemed impossibly generous, but Alexander leaned forward until their foreheads touched, and the gesture felt more intimate than any kiss. And in the library, surrounded by books, with the May afternoon golden around them, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe that she was not simply being rescued, but genuinely loved, not for what she might become, but for exactly who she already was. Lady Harrington's ballroom on the evening of May the 7th glowed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors that lined the walls, and Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase with her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm, feeling her heart pound with a mixture of terror and determination as the majordomo announced in ringing tones the Duke of Sinclair and Miss Eleanor Pembroke, and the collective gaze of London society turned toward them with curiosity and judgment written in equal measure across their elegant faces. Eleanor wore the new emerald-green silk gown that Madame Dubois had delivered that morning, cut in a style that flattered her figure without the punishing strictures she had endured at the opera, and the sapphire engagement ring caught the candlelight with flashes of brilliant blue fire that seemed to announce her changed circumstances to anyone who looked at her left hand. Alexander looked down at her with such obvious pride and affection that Eleanor felt some of her anxiety ease even as they descended the stairs into the throng of guests, and she could feel his strength and steadiness flowing into her through the point where his hand covered hers on his sleeve, an anchor in the storm of scrutiny that awaited them below. "You are radiant," Alexander murmured for her ears alone as they reached the bottom step. "And I am the most fortunate man in this room or any other." And Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words, even as she caught sight of Lydia Fairfax holding court near the refreshment table, with a cluster of society matrons who seemed to be watching Eleanor's arrival, with expressions ranging from cautious welcome to barely concealed disdain. The first test came within moments when Lady Harrington herself approached to offer formal congratulations, and though her smile was polite, there was a calculating assessment in her eyes as she looked Eleanor over from head to toe, taking in the fine gown and jewels, but also the uncertain bearing of someone not yet accustomed to such grand surroundings. "How lovely you look, my dear," Lady Harrington said, with a tone that managed to sound both complimentary and faintly surprised. "I do hope you are recovering from your unfortunate incident at the opera. Such a dreadful business, but how fortunate that His Grace was present to render assistance." Eleanor felt the barb beneath the pleasantries, but before she could formulate a response, Alexander spoke with cool authority. Fortune had nothing to do with it. "Lady Harrington, I consider it providence that I was in a position to help Miss Pembroke when others were too paralyzed by false propriety to act, and I find that a person's character is best judged by their conduct in crisis rather than by their adherence to social niceties that value reputation over human life." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable, and Lady Harrington's smile became slightly fixed as she inclined her head and moved away. And Eleanor looked up at Alexander with gratitude and growing confidence as they moved deeper into the ballroom, where other guests approached to offer congratulations or simply to stare. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, Alexander turned to Eleanor with a smile that held both invitation and challenge. "May I have the honor?" he said formally, though his eyes were warm with private affection, and Eleanor nodded mutely as he led her onto the dance floor, where the scandalous intimacy of the waltz would put them on display for every gossip in the room, his hand warm at her waist and his eyes never leaving hers as they moved together through the turns and swirls of the dance. And in that moment, with Alexander holding her as though she were infinitely precious, Eleanor finally began to believe that perhaps she truly did belong in this glittering world after all. Not because of her new position, but because she was dancing with a man who saw her true worth and proclaimed it to anyone who cared to watch. The journey to Sinclair Park on the afternoon of May chapter 10th took them through countryside that was lush with late spring growth, the hedgerows thick with white hawthorn blossoms, and the fields beyond painted in shades of emerald and gold. And Eleanor sat beside Alexander in his open carriage, feeling the warm breeze play across her face and lift the ribbons of her bonnet as they left London's smoke and noise behind for the rolling peace of the Hertfordshire landscape. This was the first time they had travelled together beyond the confines of the city, and there was a freedom in the open road that seemed to ease something in both of them, Alexander's shoulders losing their careful tension as he pointed out landmarks and estate boundaries with the enthusiasm of a man genuinely eager to share his world. And Eleanor found herself laughing at his stories of childhood adventures in these fields and woods, a playful side of him emerging that made him seem younger and less burdened by ducal responsibility. When the estate came into view, Eleanor's breath caught, because Sinclair Park was magnificent in a way that was both grand and somehow welcoming, the great house built of honey-colored stone that glowed warm in the afternoon sunlight, with tall windows that reflected the sky and extensive gardens that spread out in formal terraces before giving way to more natural parkland dotted with ancient oaks and graceful willows. The staff had assembled to greet them, and Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness as the carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, came forward with a warm smile that reached her eyes and a curtsy that was respectful without being obsequious, and she welcomed Eleanor with words that suggested genuine pleasure rather than mere duty. Alexander kept his hand at the small of Eleanor's back as they toured the house, a steady presence that helped ground her as she tried to take in the scale of what would soon be her home. The grand entrance hall with its marble floors and sweeping staircase, the formal drawing rooms and intimate parlours, the dining room that could seat 40 guests, And finally the library that made Eleanor stop in her tracks with a small gasp of wonder, because it was even more extensive than the one in London. 3 stories of books accessible by a graceful spiral staircase, with windows overlooking the gardens and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the light. "You could spend every day here if you wished," Alexander said softly, as he watched her turn slowly to take it all in. "And I would count myself fortunate to find you among the shelves whenever I came looking." And Eleanor turned to him with tears pricking her eyes, because he understood her so completely, knew that this room was worth more to her than all the grand state apartments and ballrooms combined. They walked through the gardens afterward, following gravel paths between beds of roses just beginning to bloom and through an arched trellis heavy with early clematis. And when they reached the lake that lay at the edge of the formal grounds, Alexander drew her down to sit beside him on a stone bench beneath a willow tree, the water before them reflecting the clouds and the surrounding trees in mirror-perfect stillness. "This is where I want to build our life," Alexander said quietly as he took both her hands in his, "not in London's ballrooms or society's judgment, but here in this place where we can simply be ourselves, where you can pursue your interests and I can support you in whatever you wish to accomplish." And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, not as a duchess playing a role, but as a woman fully known and deeply cherished. And she leaned forward to kiss him with a tenderness that held all her gratitude and growing love, accepting finally and completely that this extraordinary life was truly hers to claim. The morning of May 15th dawned bright and clear over London, and Eleanor woke in the comfortable guest room at Mrs. Beaumont's townhouse, with her heart fluttering between joy and nervousness, as she realized that in just 2 days she would become the Duchess of Sinclair, a transformation so complete and improbable that even now, after weeks of preparation, some part of her still struggled to believe it was truly happening. The wedding dress hung on the wardrobe door where Mrs. Beaumont had placed it the evening before, and Eleanor rose to touch the ivory silk with tentative fingers, marveling at its simple elegance, because she had insisted against Alexander's gentle protests that she did not want elaborate embroidery or excessive ornamentation, preferring clean lines and quality fabric that would let her be herself rather than trying to compete with brides who had been groomed for grand society weddings since childhood. Mrs. Beaumont arrived with chocolate and toast on a tray, settling onto the edge of the bed with the comfortable familiarity of their long friendship. And together they reviewed the final preparations, while Eleanor tried to eat despite the anxious excitement that made her stomach feel full of butterflies. The small guest list of fewer than 50 people a relief after the ordeal of Lady Harrington's ball, Alexander having agreed with her preference for intimacy over spectacle, despite his position requiring some degree of ceremony. A knock at the door mid-morning brought a footman with a message that the Duke of Sinclair had arrived and requested a few moments of Miss Pembroke's time if she was receiving visitors, and Eleanor's pulse quickened as she hurried downstairs to the small sitting room where Alexander waited, looking somehow both perfectly composed and slightly nervous himself, his hands clasped behind his back as he turned at her entrance. "I know it is irregular to see you so close to the wedding," he said with a smile that held a hint of uncertainty, "but I wanted to give you something pivotally before we are caught up in the final rush of preparations," and Eleanor moved closer, feeling her own smile bloom in response to his presence, the simple fact of being near him enough to steady her jangled nerves. Alexander drew a folded paper from his coat and held it out to her, and when Eleanor opened it, she found herself looking at an architectural drawing of a room lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, large windows onto walls to provide abundant light, and comfortable chairs arranged near a fireplace. And she looked up at him in confusion until he explained softly that he had commissioned the renovations of the morning room at Sinclair House to create a library entirely for her use, a space where she could retreat whenever she wished to read or think or simply be alone with her thoughts. The thoughtfulness of it, the clear evidence that he had been planning this gift for weeks while attending to all the other wedding preparations, broke through the last of Eleanor's composure, and she felt tears spill hot down her cheeks as she looked between the drawing and Alexander's anxious face. And when she could finally speak, her voice came out choked with emotion as she told him that no one in her entire life had ever given her something so perfectly suited to who she truly was. A gift that saw not the Duchess she was becoming, but the woman who had always found her greatest joy among books and ideas. Alexander stepped forward to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, and he told her in a voice rough with his own emotion that he loved her not for what she would become, but for exactly who she already was, and that every day for the rest of their lives he intended to prove to her that she was cherished beyond measure. And Eleanor reached up to pull his face down to hers and kissed him with a fierce tenderness that held all her gratitude and wonder and growing certainty that somehow, against all probability, she had found not just love, but true partnership with a man who saw her completely. The morning of May 17th dawned with the sort of perfect spring clarity that seemed to bless important occasions, and Eleanor woke in the guest room at Mrs. Beaumont's townhouse, with her heart racing and her hands trembling as the full reality of what this day meant washed over her in waves of joy and disbelief and wonder, because in just a few hours she would stand before witnesses and become the Duchess of Sinclair, a transformation so complete that the terrified poor relation who had fainted at the opera barely more than a month ago seemed like a different person entirely. Mrs. Beaumont arrived with chocolate and warm rolls and helped Eleanor dress with gentle efficiency, fastening the ivory silk gown that fell in clean, elegant lines from the high waist and arranging Eleanor's dark hair in a simple style with just a few curls framing her face and a coronet of white roses that Alexander had sent that morning with a note that read, "Simply, I cannot wait to call you my wife." And when Eleanor finally looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the plain, overlooked spinster she had been trained to see, but a woman radiant with happiness and worthy of the love that had so unexpectedly found her. The carriage ride to St. George's, Hanover Square, passed in a blur of London streets and Eleanor's nervous breathing, and when they arrived at the church, she was grateful for Mrs. Beaumont's steadying hand on her arm as they entered through the side door to wait in the small vestibule while the guests assembled, and through the partially open door, Eleanor could see the interior of the church with its soaring columns and the morning light streaming through tall windows to illuminate the space with a soft golden glow. The gathering was small, as she and Alexander had agreed upon, perhaps 40 people in the pews, mostly his close friends and a few of Eleanor's scattered acquaintances, and she noticed with a mixture of relief and bitter satisfaction that Lady Catherine Ashford was conspicuously absent, though Lord Charles sat in a rear pew looking uncomfortable in his finest coat, and the guests who were present included several of the reformist thinkers from Alexander's dinner party, along with his elderly aunt and various friends from his club who had proven supportive of the unconventional match. The music began, and Mrs. Beaumont squeezed Eleanor's hand once before releasing it and taking her place. And then Eleanor was walking alone down the aisle with her bouquet of white roses clutched in trembling fingers and her eyes fixed on the man who waited for her at the altar. And Alexander turned as she approached, and the expression on his face was so full of open emotion and joy and certainty that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, because no one had ever looked at her with such unguarded love before. He reached for her hand as she arrived beside him, and his fingers closed warm and steady around hers, and Eleanor looked up into his eyes and saw her entire future reflected there as the vicar began the ancient words of the marriage ceremony, his voice carrying through the hushed church with solemn authority as he spoke of the sacred bond being formed and the commitments being made before God and these witnesses. When it came time for the vows, Eleanor's voice shook only slightly as she repeated the words that bound her to Alexander, promising to love and honor and cherish him for all the days of her life. And Alexander's voice was deeper and rougher than usual as he made his own vows to her, with an intensity that made it clear these were not merely traditional words, but promises he fully intended to keep. And when the vicar pronounced them, husband and wife, and Alexander leaned down to kiss her, with tender reverence, Eleanor heard Mrs. Beaumont's happy weeping from the front pew and felt her own tears finally spill over as she kissed her husband back, and knew with absolute certainty that her life had been transformed in every possible way. The wedding breakfast at Sinclair House was an intimate affair, with perhaps 30 guests gathered in the grand dining room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated the long table set with fine china and crystal. And Eleanor moved through the celebration in a daze of happiness, acutely aware of the gold band now resting on her finger beside the sapphire engagement ring and the new title that seemed to shimmer in the air around her like something both impossibly foreign and increasingly real with every person who addressed her as Your Grace or the Duchess of Sinclair. Alexander remained close beside her throughout the meal, his hand finding hers beneath the table whenever conversation swirled around them. And Eleanor noticed with a mixture of wonder and satisfaction how the guests who had once looked through her as though she were invisible now sought her attention and deferred to her opinions, the transformation in their behavior so complete that it would have been laughable if it were not also a sobering reminder of how much society valued rank over character. Mrs. Beaumont glowed with proud happiness from her seat near the head of the table, and when she caught Eleanor's eye, she raised her glass in a private toast that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes, because this woman had been kind to her when kindness cost social capital, and now she was being rewarded with the satisfaction of seeing her friend elevated to a position of security and love that neither of them could have imagined just 5 weeks ago. The speeches were mercifully brief, mostly warm wishes from Alexander's close friends who had come to appreciate Eleanor's intelligence and character during the courtship, and when Alexander himself rose to thank the guests, his voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with emotion as he looked down at Eleanor and said simply that he was the most fortunate man in England to have found a woman of such grace and wisdom and strength, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of her trust. The afternoon was well advanced when Alexander leaned close to murmur that the carriage was ready whenever she wished to depart for Sinclair Park, and Eleanor felt her breath catch and her pulse quicken, because leaving meant truly beginning their married life together with all the intimacy and vulnerability that entailed. And though she trusted Alexander completely, there was still a nervous flutter in her stomach as she nodded and rose from the table with him. The farewell to Mrs. Beaumont was tearful and prolonged, with promises to write often and visit soon. And then Eleanor was settling into the familiar comfort of Alexander's carriage, with her husband beside her and the sounds of London gradually fading as they headed into the countryside. And Alexander took her hand and raised it to his lips, and told her softly that she looked beautiful, and that he loved her, and that he would be patient and gentle with her always. And Eleanor turned to him with tears of gratitude and joy in her eyes, and kissed him with all the love and trust and wonder that filled her heart, knowing that she was finally and truly home. The 2 weeks at Sinclair Park passed in a haze of golden summer light and deepening intimacy, as Eleanor settled into her new life with a sense of wonder that never quite faded, even as the initial strangeness of being addressed as Your Grace and having servants attend to her every need gradually became familiar, and the estate itself revealed its charms slowly through long walks in the gardens, where roses bloomed in profusion and the air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass, through quiet mornings in the library where Alexander had indeed created a space entirely for her use, with shelves waiting to be filled according to her own preferences, and through leisurely afternoons when they rode together across the parkland, and Alexander pointed out tenant farms and explained his plans for improvements while asking her opinion with genuine interest that still surprised her. Eleanor found herself thinking often of the woman she had been just 2 months ago, that frightened, poor relation who had believed herself destined for a life of invisibility and quiet desperation. And the contrast with her current reality was so stark that sometimes she had to touch the gold band on her finger or catch sight of herself in a mirror wearing one of her beautiful new gowns to convince herself this was not an elaborate dream from which she would soon wake back in her cramped attic room at the Ashford residence. But Alexander was very real beside her each night and each morning, patient and tender and increasingly passionate as Eleanor's initial nervousness gave way to trust and then to her own awakening desire. And she discovered that physical intimacy with someone who truly loved her was a revelation of connection and vulnerability that bound them together in ways she had never imagined possible. The letters from Mrs. Beaumont arrived regularly with news from London, reporting that society had largely accepted the match after the initial scandal died down, and that Eleanor's new position as Duchess of Sinclair commanded the respect that rank always guaranteed regardless of how that rank had been achieved, and there was particular satisfaction in Mrs. Beaumont's account of encountering Lady Catherine at a shop where Catherine had been forced to curtsy to Mrs. Beaumont as a courtesy to her close friendship with the Duchess, a reversal of power that Eleanor tried not to take too much pleasure in, even as she could not help but smile. But more important than social triumph was the quiet domestic happiness Eleanor discovered in simply being with Alexander, learning his habits and preferences and moods, observing how he managed his estates with conscientiousness, and how he treated his servants with respect, and finding that he listened to her ideas with genuine consideration, especially when she tentatively mentioned her thought of establishing a small school for the daughters of tenant farmers and village families who currently had no access to education. Alexander's immediate enthusiasm for the project and his practical suggestions for how to implement it made Eleanor's heart swell with gratitude and love, because he was not merely indulging her as a wealthy man might humor his wife's charitable whims, but was genuinely partnering with her to create something meaningful. And within days, they had identified a suitable building in the village and begun making plans to hire a teacher and gather supplies. On their last evening before they were due to return to London for a brief visit, Eleanor and Alexander walked through the gardens in the long twilight of early summer, and Alexander pulled her close beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, and told her that these past weeks had been the happiest of his life. And Eleanor looked up at her husband with tears of joy in her eyes, and knew that she had finally found the home she had been seeking all her life, not in a place but in the heart of a man who saw her true worth and loved her not despite her past, but because of everything she was. The September evening air carried a hint of autumn's approach as Eleanor and Alexander returned to London for the season and prepared to attend the opera at the very theatre where their extraordinary story had begun just 5 months earlier, and Eleanor found herself standing before her mirror in the Sinclair townhouse, adjusting the sapphire necklace that matched her engagement ring, while marveling quietly at the woman reflected back at her, a woman who wore silk and jewels with easy confidence, and whose eyes held the glow of deep happiness rather than the resigned dimness of invisible suffering. Alexander appeared behind her in the mirror and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, asking if she was ready to face the place where she had nearly died, and where he had first truly seen her. And Eleanor nodded and turned to kiss him softly, before taking his arm and allowing him to lead her to the carriage that bore the ducal crest on its doors. The Royal Opera House was ablaze with light, and crowded with elegantly dressed members of society who parted respectfully as the Duke and Duchess of Sinclair made their way to the ducal box that had once held only Alexander, and now accommodated them both, along with Mrs. Beaumont as their honoured guest. And Eleanor could feel curious eyes upon her, but there was no longer any cruelty in those gazes, only the cautious respect that society always afforded to rank, and the grudging admiration that some offered to a woman who had risen so dramatically from obscurity. As they settled into their seats, Eleanor's gaze drifted across the theatre to the box where she had sat that terrible April night in borrowed blue silk, with her ribs compressed to the point of death, and she saw with a mixture of satisfaction and pity that Lady Catherine was seated there beside Lord Charles, her crimson gown and haughty posture unable to disguise the diminishment of her social position, now that she had lost the reflected glory of housing the Duchess of Sinclair and had gained instead the reputation of a woman who had mistreated a relation who proved more worthy than anyone had imagined. Catherine's eyes met Eleanor's for one brief moment across the crowded theatre, and Eleanor inclined her head in a gesture that was neither triumphant nor cruel, but simply acknowledged the vast distance that now separated their positions. And then she turned her attention back to Alexander, who was watching her with love and pride, and who took her hand as the lights dimmed and the music began. The opera was beautiful, and Eleanor lost herself in the performance, no longer struggling to breathe or wishing herself invisible, but instead sitting beside her husband in perfect comfort and security. And when intermission arrived and they stepped out into the corridor, she was greeted with respectful curtsies and warm congratulations on the school she had established for tenant farmers' daughters, a project that had already attracted notice and admiration from reformist circles in London. Walking through those same halls where she had once been carried unconscious and dishevelled in Alexander's arms, Eleanor reflected on the strange mercy of fate that had brought her to the very edge of death in order to deliver her into a life more full and purposeful than any she had dared imagine. And she thought of all the women who even now sat in similar positions of powerlessness and invisibility, and she resolved to use her new position to advocate for those whom society overlooked, just as she had once been overlooked. As the evening drew to a close and she and Alexander prepared to depart, Eleanor paused at the top of the grand staircase and looked back at the glittering theatre where her life had irrevocably changed. And Alexander leaned close to whisper that he loved her and that he thanked heaven daily for the chance that had brought her into his life. And Eleanor smiled and took his arm and stepped forward into the night, knowing that her story was proof that transformation is always possible, that true worth will ultimately be recognized by those with eyes to see it, and that it is never too late for a new beginning when love and courage align to rewrite what seemed an unchangeable fate.